Welcome to our video on sample size issues in pilot studies. My name is Saskia Eddy and I'm a PhD student based at Queen Mary University of London. And my PhD is focusing on the sample size of external pilot studies. Today, I will be talking to Professor Mike Campbell.
Hello, I've been working on pilot studies for about 10 years and I've been working with Saskia for about 2 years on pilot studies. And today we're going to be talking about power calculations for pilot studies.
So Mike, I think it's important, first of all, to talk about what makes pilot studies different from main trials before discussing the sample size. So just so we're clear that pilot studies are smaller studies done before conducting the main trial, and they focus on feasibility, not on efficacy or effectiveness. So for external pilot studies, how do you decide on its size?
Well, the basic premise that hypothesis testing of whether an intervention differs from a control isn't actually appropriate for a pilot study, because pilot studies are really trying to determine recruitment rates and things like that. So power-based sample size calculations using the effect size from an outcome variable are not appropriate. However, you still need to be able to say why you've chosen a particular sample size for a pilot study. So what we need is what we call a sample size justification, so that you can present that to grant-giving bodies, for example, to say why you need that number of people in your study. Well, there's been quite a lot of published guidance about the sample size for pilot studies. Way back 25 years ago, Rob Brown suggested that you needed about 30 patients to estimate a parameter. And this is based on the fact that with about 30 patients, you can estimate a variance with a reasonable amount of accuracy for putting into a sample size calculation. And this relates also to what Steve Julius said, he said you need a minimum of about 12 per group, so 24 in total for a two-group trial. And again, he's talking about precision about the mean and the variance. But two other authors, Stallard and Cox and Torgerson, have argued that really you should base your sample size of your pilot on what you expect the size of your main trial to be. So if you're going to have a small main trial, then you don't want a sample size for a pilot, which is going to be half of the main trial. So for a small trial, you want a small pilot study, but for a large trial, you could get away with a larger pilot study, and they vary in what they do. Stallard says 3%, and Cox and Torgerson have said 9%. Simon Lewis is saying, well, if the main aim is to try and estimate a sample size for the main trial, and you're estimating a variance, then what you perhaps do is to calculate the variance on the pilot, and then use the upper 95% limit on the confidence interval to base your sample size for the main trial. So they suggest you need at least 50 in order to do that with a reasonable amount of accuracy. And then Dawn and Tier did a survey to see what other people had done, and they found that they needed about 35 group to estimate a standard deviation, or between a 60 and 100 per group if you're trying to estimate an event rate, such as the proportion of people who consent or the people who you can randomize into your trial. Thank you.
So have there been any other ideas or suggestions in the published literature?
Well, there's been a number of other ideas. Amy Whitehead and her group, they said, well, really, you should try and minimize the total sample size of the pilot plus the main trial, because you are using up the patients in the pilot. You're not going to put them into the main trial, so you want to actually minimize the total sample size. And there's been quite a bit of research recently.
So thank you so much, Mike, for letting me interview you. It's been really helpful catching up with you. And I'm looking forward to discussing more about sample size with you in our in-depth talk on sample size.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And here's our references.